Okay, you might be presented with a time series graph. So that has the form of axes, and we've got time on a scale on this axis. And then we've got some values of something that changes over time. So it looks a little bit like a scatter graph. So we've got various observed values as we go over time. Okay, now there are two kinds of lines that you see on this diagram. It's perfectly legitimate to guide the eye to join these crosses with straight lines. Okay, so we can see how something's varying from one year, it might be, to the next. Okay, but what we're looking for when we do a time series is a trend. So if you put a line of best fit, a regression type line on this, then you get a straight line through the points, if that seems to be appropriate. Okay, just as with a correlation and regression, you'd want to think that the points are genuinely close to a line, that it is a linear relationship. Okay, so we may have a trend line. Okay, we may think that there isn't a trend that's a line, it might be non-linear. Okay, and we can also see that there is scatter about that trend. We call that scatter variation. So the long-term underlying line we call the trend, and then the if you like, the residuals up and down from that we think of as being variation about that trend. So as an example here would have obviously our axes on here, x, and so x is time and y is whatever we're measuring. Okay, so here we can see we've got an upward linear trend, but the variation about that trend is really quite interesting. Okay, we've got a pattern of points, so we've got a point above, 2 points below, point a long way above, point above, 2 points below, point a long way above, point above. We can see that there's a repeating pattern of 4 types of variation. Okay, and this would suggest to me, I mean, one very common situation where you see this is when time is maybe the measurements are being made maybe 4 times a year, and we get different kinds of patterns in different seasons. So this is about employment. We might find that employment is above trend in some times of year, maybe in the summer, and it's below trend at other times of year. Okay, so this is called, even if it's not actually seasons of the year, this is called seasonal variation on an upward linear trend. Okay, so there's a pattern to the variation. Whereas over the page, when we look at the next examples, okay, this is clearly a downward linear trend, but this time the variation is not patterned. Some are above, some are below, but not in a predictable way. So this is random variation about a downward linear trend. We've still got a sensible straight line through the points. And this next one, okay, we've got an upward linear trend clearly, and this time this might turn out to be seasonal if this pattern continues. What we can say is that it's a smooth pattern. So if I was below trend at one time, I'm likely to be low trend just before it or just after it. So we call this short-term variation because the long-term effect is the trend line, but the variations, there seems to be lasting, but only short-term lasting effects that take me above or below that trend line. So this could be the general growth of the economy, but within that there might be times that are a bit more prosperous or times that are a bit leaner within that long-term trend. So we say short-term variation about an upward linear trend. And this one here, this is clearly a non-linear trend. It's a downward non-linear trend. And the kind of variation we've got, well, some are above, some are below, doesn't seem to be a pattern. So this is random variation. So random variation about a downward non-linear trend. Okay, so I'd like you to be aware of the fact that the long-term effect is the trend, that the dotting about on either side of that trend is called variation, and that there are different kinds of variation. In particular, the difference between random variation, which we see in this one, and the very patterned effect that we saw in the first one. Be aware that sometimes variation is in a very structured pattern, and that's called seasonal variation, and it may well be because of different seasons in the year.